Jake Paul isn't infamously known as the internet's problem child for nothing, with him making the jump from content creation to pro boxing and actually getting wins. Things have been gradually building up to something exciting. Enter Nate Diaz, the legendary MMA artist, finishing his UFC contract, and the two seem to be on a road to an epic clash. Stay tuned for more details. First off, Paul calls on Diaz for a fight. Since his win over the Spider, aka Anderson Silva, Paul has established himself as a noteworthy opponent. While speaking about Paul's most recent fight, Schaub said that he was skeptical at first, thinking Jake had gotten himself into trouble. But after watching him in action, it seemed like he was outboxing him. He also said that for the level he's at, his footwork and counter shots were pretty good. Moving on to Paul, the internet star revealed in a shocking announcement that he might be moving on to MMA. He signed a multi-fight deal with the Professional Fighters League, in which he will make his debut in 2023. Although no opponent has been named for his MMA debut yet, Paul did mention that he offered a 2-fight contract with former UFC star Nate Diaz. He also said that he already has the venue booked and just needs Diaz to sign the offer. If the two manage to reach an agreement, fans can look forward to seeing Jake Paul and Nate Diaz in a boxing ring, as well as an MMA match. According to Paul, he's done the majority of the work from his side for the potential matches with Diaz. Now all he needs is for the other side to come on board with the decision. We have to admit, it would be a pretty exciting match if the two managed to enter the same ring. With Nate's experience and Paul's newly found skills, it would be sure to keep the audience on its toes throughout the fight. Next up, Nate Diaz gets warned not to underestimate Paul. Well, Paul doesn't exactly have the best reputation. From his problematic YouTube career to now suddenly rising in the combat game, many accused Paul of celebrating fixed victories. But after proving his worth in the ring, it seems he's won over several MMA personalities. Following his win against Silva, Paul has already chosen Nate Diaz as his opponent for his next big spectacle. Diaz was in the crowd for the early fights, and although he was nowhere to be found by the time the main event ended, Paul sees the opportunity to call for him and Canelo Alvarez by name, challenging them both to a match. Jake has nowhere near the same level of professional fighting experience as 37-year-old Diaz, but he's made a name for himself in the boxing world after his recent string of high-profile knockouts. Now, being considered a potential threat, former UFC lightweight champion Frankie Edgar warned Nate Diaz about the dangers of facing off against the social media personality. During a podcast with Edgar and Brian Callen, Schaub even claimed that it would be a mistake to underestimate Paul and called him the real deal. The guy has really built his way up into the boxing scene. Well, the Stockton native is no outsider to the sports combat world himself. What's more, he's an experienced veteran of the UFC with a professional record of 21-13. His impressive skills have helped him gain victories over top contenders like Conor McGregor and Anthony Pettis. Moving on, Michael Bisping calls Jake Paul challenging Nate Diaz to an MMA fight all smoke and mirrors. Bisping believes that Paul's entrance into mixed martial arts is just another promotional trick. The problem child recently signed with the PFL, with plans to compete in MMA with his first opponent potentially being Diaz. The two have publicly jabbed at each other in the past, with the possibility of a match between the two increasing as Diaz became a free agent following UFC 279. Although one would assume Diaz would have the upper hand in the cage, Bisping seems to have a problem with the fact that Paul is once again targeting an opponent smaller than him, and that he's the one dictating the terms of the fight. While talking about it on his YouTube channel, he said that Paul weighs over 200 pounds, while Diaz is generally a lightweight. He's bigger and stronger, and wants to go first because he wants to beat him in that first match, so that he gets in Diaz's head for when they do have the fight. But Bisping doesn't think it would get sanctioned, since Paul's way too big. He also mentioned all of this was just Paul trying to figure out how he can continue to make money, and he can't do that in boxing, since he would most likely be defeated. Regardless of how the fight plays out, Bisping thinks Paul chose Diaz as his latest opponent based on his popularity and name recognition, instead of in the interest of building a legitimate mixed martial arts resume. What's more, fans were quick to bet on Jake versus Diaz. Barely 24 hours after Paul announced his decision to sign with the PFL to make his MMA debut, fans had already started started placing bets on potential opponents they could see him fighting against, the top contender being the very person Paul called out himself, Nate Diaz. Although Nate still hadn't responded to the call-out, that didn't stop bettors from placing money on potential outcomes. The bet came in 3 categories: who'd win in a boxing match, an MMA match, and a double match outcome. According to the public, while Paul takes the lead in a boxing match, Nate surpasses him in the MMA ring. By now, it's popular opinion that Paul would easily overtake Diaz in the boxing category, but that's because he has a tremendous size advantage over Diaz, who's fought as high as 177 pounds in MMA, while the social media influencer weighs at over 200 pounds. Many doubt that the fight would even get approved because of the huge weight class difference. There are also doubts surrounding whether the fight will even take place. Diaz has just become a free agent and has a lot of different options open for him right now, while a common string among Paul's opponents is that fighting him is their last way to get a big paycheck before retiring. Moving on, Nate Diaz has his eyes on Jake Paul for future fight. First off, Diaz's time with the UFC expires. The longtime UFC fighter and MMA star has officially finished his contract and has been removed from the UFC roster. His final fight was against Tony Ferguson at UFC 279 on September 10th. According to Diaz's representative, Zach Rosenfield, they were still undergoing negotiations about a deal with the UFC, which had ended, and were now looking further to immediately begin discussions about future fights. The 37-year-old beat Ferguson via 4th-round submission, leaving the UFC still perched on his high horse. The UFC champion joined the sport in the 5th season of The Ultimate Fighter reality show in 2007 and has been involved in some of the biggest fights in recent years, including a pair of bouts with Conor McGregor and a contest for the legendary BMF title against Jorge Masvidal. In an interview with ESPN, he shared that he plans on making his return back to the UFC eventually, but for the time being, he wants to move towards boxing and was going to seek opportunities outside of the promotion. He has plans to promote himself in bouts through Real Fights Inc., his promotional entity that he's recently created. Moving on, let's talk a little more about a potential Diaz versus Paul. Recently reaching the end of his contract, it seems like the former UFC champion already has his options laid out for his next fight. While talking on ID Boxing, Diaz revealed that one of those options was surely Jake Paul. After all, despite his controversial past, the man has been steadily climbing his way up and has become one of the most talked about athletes. He also started his most valuable promotions to have more authority over his fighting career, all the while maintaining his previous social media and YouTube notoriety on the side. Diaz also acknowledged Paul's rising career, saying that he had a big fight ahead of him, referring to the Paul versus Anderson fight. He added that if Jake managed to win it, which we know he did, a lot of people would be very impressed, especially given Silva's skills and his time in the UFC, and that the MMA veteran was looking forward to watching the match. He's also spoken about how he was initially going to be a boxer, but since MMA shows were more common around his area, he got sucked into it. He said it was like being stuck in a cage with a whole lot of contracts, and since his contract has now finished, it's like everything is now open for the taking. Since he never stopped training for a boxing match since he started fighting when he was 17 or 18 years old, they were going to seize the opportunity when the right opponent comes. Lastly, Paul calls Diaz easy work after getting past Silva. In a news conference after the Silva fight, Paul reacted to the encounter Diaz had with his team and called him out for a fight. While talking on the MMA Hour, he said that after beating one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time, Nate Diaz just seemed like easy work. He's no comparison to the Anderson Silva. Paul also added that Diaz was slow and at the end of his career. He may still know some jiu-jitsu, but when it comes to striking, he's no better than a street fighter. He also said that boxing is like art, and street fighting wasn't going to fare well for him in the ring. After defeating Anderson, Paul is confident he'll be able to take on Diaz, saying his previous opponent had the length, the height, and packed great power in his punches. Adding fuel to the fire, he said that he was already sure of the fact that Nate would be easier to run through. While this may have been true a couple of years ago, the fact remains that neither Silva nor Diaz are in their prime anymore, so Jake shouldn't use these wins as a metric for how well he'll do in MMA. After all, there's no sport more unpredictable. That's a wrap for this video. Who do you think will be the winner in a potential Paul versus Diaz match? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more. See you at the next one.